Hi, you're listening to Fort Riley the podcast. My name is Caitlin Nauer with Garrison Public Affairs. Happy birthday, U.S. Army. The Army turned 246 years old this week. Fort Riley is celebrating in a variety of ways. So this week's podcast, we're reflecting on the great history of this installation. Joining me is our returning guest, Dr. Bob, who serves as the curator of the Fort Riley Museum Complex. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Bob.
You're quite welcome.
Fort Riley has quite a history when it comes to cavalry.
Oh, yes. Frontier post established in 1853. When the frontier moved further west, General Phil Sheridan, decided that this would be the home for the cavalry school. And so all soldiers, both enlisted and officers, would be trained in that branch here at Fort Riley. And most interestingly, Fort Riley also, since it was a very large reservation, it had all of this prairie land, it became the haying center for the United States Cavalry. So hay for all cavalry units, it went across the country. That hay went across the country. And that was largely because of the rail connections that Union Pacific had here. So, those things, transitions and those issues here still live on here at Fort Riley because the deployment for the division is so easily because of our rail transportation. They can be deployed to either coast rather rapidly. And so Fort Riley, and I always like to say this, that Fort Riley always has been able to adapt to the Army's mission over time.
You have been on this podcast before, previously speaking about Chief, the last cavalry mount on the rolls of the United States Army. What do you think the passing of Chief in 1968, what effect did that have on the U.S. Cavalry, its traditions, and its history?
Well, it was the end of an age. He was foaled prior to the Second World War. The horse cavalry was very active here at Fort Riley prior to the Second World War and even into those early years, Second World War. And so he was at sort of that transitional stage. He was that transition between the old horse-mounted cavalry here and the mechanization that took place during the Second World War with the United States Army. So Chief is kind of an interesting, transition and a segue from the old to the new.
Wow, Fort Riley has quite the story.
Frontier post, cavalry school, training post in World War I and World War II, and now home of the Big Red One. Now. So really, really interesting. The evolution of Fort Riley is really a fascinating historical story.
Thank you for joining us today. If you are interested in learning more about the storied history of Fort Riley, visit our website at home.army.mil/Riley.